Lately, I've been thinking a lot about fast fashion. Not only H&M and Zara, where I don't even really shop, but all of the ways in which fast fashion has transformed the fashion industry. The increased production pace, the environmental damage, the textile waste, but most of all, as a home dressmaker, I think about labor. I know how much work goes into making a good quality garment, and I know just how exhausting sitting at a sewing machine all day can be. I make clothes for myself for fun, but I used to work for my father's business, a small industrial manufacturing facility that makes airline ground support equipment. Jet engine covers, baggage cart covers, streamers that say remove before flight, that kind of thing. I went into this project with a particular question in mind. How does fast fashion devalue the labor that goes into clothing production? I was thinking about how we are so separated from the people and processes that create our clothes. I believe that this separation contributes to our complacence regarding labor conditions. It also leads us to look at clothes as disposable rather than something to be mended or remade into something else. I started with a particular image in mind. I chose a blouse sold by fast fashion retailer ASOS. I chose it because it resembled an Edwardian shirtwaist, a type of garment worn by women in the early 1900s. This was a symbolic choice. It was the type of garment made at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which caught fire in 1911, killing 146 people, mostly women and girls, mostly of immigrant backgrounds. The workers were locked in by their bosses to prevent thefts and unapproved breaks. Many jumped to their deaths to escape the flames. I wanted to recreate this blouse using historical methods, specifically those of the early 20th century, in order to honor the kind of work that would have been done by these workers and to illustrate the impact of increased mechanization on clothing production in the past century. When I received the blouse, I tried it on and found it ill-fitting. It was sturdy enough, but the arm size were too big, the darts were ill-placed, and it just didn't work for my body type. The fabric was cheap and thin. Though the embroidery was impeccable, machine embroidery usually is, it had clearly been done without any stabilizer, which caused a good deal of pulling. First, I had to embroider the front, and I had to do it by hand. I had ordered some quality cotton fabric, so I started by cutting out a square, which would eventually be the front of my blouse. My usual method for transferring embroidery patterns, iron-on transfer markers, was out of the question, so I did some research and found that tracing against a window was a tried-and-true method for historical embroiderers. Then I spent weeks embroidering. I started on March break at the cabin we rented, and continued through endless Netflix binges until finally I had a finished embroidery piece that matched the original around the third week of March. Then I could move on to cutting. I cheated on the pattern making process. I am bad at math, and I don't know how to draft patterns like a seamstress would have in the 1910s, nor do I have access to patterns of that vintage. So I based my pattern on a tried-and-true pattern from Gertie's Ultimate Dress Book, which is a book of interchangeable 1950s-style patterns from a blogger and dressmaker who really knows what she's doing. I knew these would fit and be closer to the style of something I'd actually wear, and I already knew which adjustments I'd need to make for my body, so the only real problem I had was drafting the sleeves. I finally came up with a version that was puffy but not quite as giant as the ones from the original blouse. I would not have had enough fabric. I cut out the fabric using stones as pattern weights, which I didn't really research as a method, but I'm pretty sure using whatever you have around is a time-honored tradition. Pattern and fabric cut out, I moved on to sewing. I started by hand while my machine was in the shop. I wanted to use a machine that was current to the time period, which meant I had to have my Singer Model 128 fixed. This is a 1949 machine, but it's a model that Singer made for more than half a century, so it was already in use in the 1910s, although this was more of a home sewing model than an industrial one. I had to make some changes to my sewing process, both for the machine and to be more historical. Normally, I finish my seams by serging. Turn whatever you're wearing inside out, look at one of the seams, and chances are you'll see what serging looks like. But that would not have been period, so I finished them either by French seams or with pinking shears. I couldn't do certain things I would normally do on my more recent machine. I couldn't backstitch to stop my stitches from unraveling, for instance. I also had to learn to use these funny bullet-shaped bobbins, which I had never done before, and which resulted in a small accident when I decided it was just fine to sew without a bobbin plate, which my machine is missing, and I got my finger stuck in the machine.
Ow. No.
I can hear what my dad will say when he watches this video, and I'm fine, Dad, and I made myself a little cardboard bobbin plate to use temporarily after that. There were a few hiccups along the way. The bobbins wouldn't wind properly, the machine started smoking when I tried to disengage the needle. I forgot to research and purchase historically appropriate interfacing or button loops, so I made do with what I had. I sewed at least one thing completely the wrong way and had to undo it, which I always do at least once. But I have a piece. A month and a half later, I have a finished piece. And I have been thinking about that. I've been thinking about the way we used to be connected to our clothes because we made our clothes, or our mothers made our clothes, or we knew the tailor or dressmaker down the road who made our clothes. I've been thinking about hand sewing and machine sewing, and how rapidly machines transformed sewing from something to be done slowly and exhaustingly, stitch by individual stitch, to something that can be produced so rapidly that a celebrity will wear something on a runway and Boohoo will offer a knockoff 2 days later. I've been thinking about the gendered nature of sewing and the labor that is done in factories around the world, mostly by women and girls, and the risks they take to their lives and limbs from their day-to-day working conditions. I've been thinking about how we don't think of sewing machines as power tools, when I almost lost my finger to one because it was missing just one small part. I've been thinking that there's no real reason why we ought to think of sewing as women's work. After all, my dad taught me to sew, and my grandfather taught him. I think that the reasons we think of it that way, perhaps the reasons we devalue it too, are tied up in the history of capital and the ideal of the nuclear family. But mostly, I've been thinking that even with modern machinery, even with a sewing machine with all the bells and whistles that my dad's machines have, sewing is skilled labor. It makes absolutely no sense that you can buy jeans for $5 on Wish. If something is that cheap, sacrifices are being made. Sacrifices to the product's quality and longevity for sure, but more likely, even than that, sacrifices to the worker's health, safety, livelihood, or even their freedom.